So we left off in the last video talking about slavery. So let's talk a little bit about and how it worked. But let's talk a little bit about the effects of the slave trade. This is going to have an impact on several different continents, and so it's pretty important for us to understand just the ramifications of the trafficking of humans and the migration, the forced migration of humans over a long period of time. So there are positive effects. We don't mean to introduce these as being like really good things that happened as a result of slavery, but there are things that have impacted all of us as a result of slavery. And I would say the biggest part of this would be in culture. So a lot of the slaves obviously are going to bring with them their cultural traits, their cultural practices. The thing that we can probably most wrap our brains around would be music. The movement of African rhythms and African songs to the Americas that develop into work songs that the slaves would sing in the fields, and eventually into the blues and jazz and rock and roll, and eventually rap even, all have their tradition and their founding in the African migration to the Americas. The negative effects, however, are really going to be the things that we focus on. This slave trade really scattered populations all over the world, and it led to unrest in Africa as different kingdoms fought against one another, and an increase of racism on three different continents, probably four different continents. And maybe one of the biggest impacts is going to be the removal of strong males and females who were captured and sent off to other areas. By doing this, particularly with the American slave trade, as we said, this wasn't such a big deal in North African and Middle Eastern slave trade because a lot of it was really an assimilation of population. But in the Americas, the real demand was for strong males and females. They wanted to make sure that they had people who were strong and healthy and could work long hours. And so this is where the demand was as far as populations. The modern effects of slavery are really going to be seen through the conditions in Africa today. We're going to talk a little bit about imperialism and the colonies within and the division of Africa. But a lot of this also has to do with the fact that there was this eventual demand for land and resources in Africa. You can imagine that with the removal of a lot of the stronger males, there was really very little resistance to any kind of colonialism or imperialism that's going to take place. And eventually, Africa is going to become heavily dependent upon European former colonial powers and the United States, and increasingly today, the Chinese, believe it or not, are heavily involved in Africa and trying to prop up political regimes and help people with aid and health supplies. This has been an ongoing condition in Africa. The biggest part for that is because the economy never really modernized. By the removal of a lot of the population and kind of the reduction in any kind of workforce, and then the eventual, what we call the scramble for Africa by European nations, really is going to lead to conditions that are going to set modern African states up for failure. In addition, we have a lot of health problems that have occurred or originated in Africa. Diseases like HIV and AIDS, malaria, cholera, Ebola. These are all conditions that impoverish people. And I don't mean you have to be impoverished to experience them, but impoverished people living in areas where there are warm, wet climates are going to be exposed to a lot of these diseases, and treatment for these diseases oftentimes exist, but people in Africa don't have access to them. And when we talk about political problems, the history of African nations, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, they're really highlighted by a lot of instability and corruption. There's been ongoing warfare, civil wars, border wars, the rise of authoritarian single rule leaders in a lot of these countries. The use of military dictatorships throughout many of these countries, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But even continuing today, you get this continuation of of powerful African rulers who really kind of collaborate with one another to increase their power in a particular region. We also have the rise of tribal warfare within these states. When the European countries divided up Africa, they didn't do it according to tribal territories. They did it according to resources. And so we have a condition that was set up where you have several different tribes who maybe were forced to live together in a state, and they could have been rival tribes that were forced to have to try to come up with a way to run a country. And in many cases, it might have worked initially when the Europeans were still heavily involved and able to kind of simmer some of the anger that would rise up between these tribes. But once these European nations were kind of thoroughly out of the African scene, a lot of these countries just devolved into civil war. People killing one another, events of genocide in places like Rwanda and Darfur. So we see a lot of negative results that really come out of, they're not a direct result of slavery, but over the years the conditions had been set up that led a lot of these countries to have to deal with conditions that were less than ideal.